Is it possible to revere the art while unflinchingly recognizing that the artist was, by many objective measures, a disaster of a human being, a hypocrite on an operatic scale, and a musician who, in the latter half of his career, survived largely on the fumes of a reputation built by his former partner? We are long overdue for a difficult adult conversation about John Winston Lennon. If you have arrived here seeking hagiography, looking to light a candle at the altar of the secular saint with the round wire-rimmed glasses, you should turn back immediately. We are going to dismantle the White Steinway, release the doves, and tear down the war is over billboards to examine the man who was, without question, one of the greatest rhythm guitarists in the history of rock, specifically in the early Beatles era, but who also became the primary victim and eventually the willing architect of his own suffocating mythology. As musicians and critical listeners, we must learn to listen with our ears, not with our nostalgia. When we strip away the layers of cultural excess, the story of Lennon is not that of a working-class hero guiding the proletariat to a socialist utopia. It is the story of a middle-class boy, deeply traumatized and profoundly insecure, who romanticized a poverty he never endured, abused those he claimed to love, and used music less to heal the world and more to scream for the attention of the parents who abandoned him. It is a narrative of initial technical brilliance that slowly gave way to creative lethargy, and of a songwriting partnership that was less a seamless brotherhood of equals and more a case of one man increasingly carrying the logistical and musical weight of the other. To truly understand the musical trajectory of John Lennon, we must first offer full-throated recognition of his brilliance as an instrumentalist. This is the point where lazy revisionism often fails. Before the gurus, the bed-ins, and the weight of being a genius, Lennon was a rock and roll monster. If you pick up a short-scale Rickenbacker 325, strung with flat wounds, and attempt to play with the ferocity he displayed during the Hamburg residency or the Cavern days, you will realize it is an act of physical brutality. Lennon was not a player of finesse, he was a human engine. Listen closely to the triplets in All My Loving. The melody belongs to Paul McCartney, jaunty and optimistic, but the relentless drive, that machine gun gallop that propels the song forward, is entirely the work of Lennon's right hand. He possessed a rigid wrist and a technique of cutting through guitar strings with a percussive violence that defined the initial sound of the Beatles. In those early days, he led the band not just because he was the oldest or the sharpest wit, but because he was the loudest. He cut through the mix. His voice, shredding his larynx on Twist and Shout, recorded in one take at the end of a grueling session, was not an aesthetic affectation. It was an act of pure necessity, the sound of a man tearing himself apart to be heard above the noise. However, as the band migrated from the sweaty confines of the clubs to the experimental laboratory of EMI Studios, a shift occurred, a shift that casual fans often ignore, to preserve the narrative of the perfect partnership. By late 1966 and early 1967, the dynamic had inverted. While Lennon was still contributing masterpieces like Strawberry Fields Forever and I Am the Walrus, the architect of the band's evolution was increasingly Paul McCartney. The narrative that John was the avant-garde experimentalist and Paul was the safe balladeer is a falsehood. It was Paul who was immersed in the London underground scene, listening to Stockhausen and Luciano Berio. It was Paul who brought the tape loops to Tomorrow Never Knows, constructing the sonic chaos that John had envisioned, but had no technical idea how to execute. John had the spark, the surrealist lyrics, and the raw emotional intent, but he increasingly lacked the discipline to finish the job. He would bring fragments to the studio. It was Paul, alongside George Martin, who would spend hours refining the middle eights, arranging the harmonies, and overdubbing counterpoint bass lines to turn John's sketches into records. By the time of the Sgt. Pepper sessions, John was essentially a passenger in a vehicle Paul was driving. He resented McCartney's competence, deriding his compositions as granny music, mocking Obladi Oblada and Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Yet he happily pocketed the royalties those massive hits generated. He wanted to lead, but he was too immersed in LSD and later the debilitating fog of heroin addiction to take the wheel. We must also confront the uncomfortable truth regarding the dissolution of the Beatles. Yoko Ono did not destroy the band. That is a lazy, misogynistic trope. The reality is that John used her as a blunt instrument because he was codependent, and too cowardly to confront his bandmates directly regarding his desire to leave. This is not an attack on Yoko's art. The point is how John weaponized her presence. He violated the band's unwritten sacred rule of no wives in the studio during the Abbey Road sessions, following a car accident in Scotland. He famously had a bed installed in the studio for her, forcing the other 3 musicians and the engineering staff to work around her physical presence. He allowed her to critique takes and influence the creative process, deliberately creating a toxic environment that forced Paul, George, and Ringo to be the ones to pull the trigger on the band's existence. He needed to be the victim, the martyr who chose love over corporate confinement, when in reality, he had exhausted his creativity within the group format and required a scapegoat to justify his exit. In his solo career, the image of the hypocritical saint crystallized. Let us look at Imagine. Musically, it is a deceptively simple composition, largely oscillating between C major and F major, with a standard bridge to E major, competent but hardly revolutionary. Lyrically, however, it is perhaps the most insincere piece of pop philosophy ever recorded. Here was a multimillionaire living in the exclusive Dakota building, maintaining a fleet of luxury cars, including a psychedelic Rolls-Royce, owning a dairy farm and expansive real estate, and wearing fur coats, preaching to the working class to imagine no possessions. This was a man prone to violent outbursts. He assaulted Cavern Club DJ Bob Wooler at Paul's 21st birthday party, beating him so severely he required hospitalization, simply because Wooler jokingly insinuated a romantic link between John and Brian Epstein. He admitted in interviews to hitting his first wife, Cynthia, and subjected her to years of emotional neglect. Yet, he successfully rebranded himself as the Apostle of Peace. The genius of Lennon lay not in his moral consistency, but in his marketing. He washed away the violence, the negligence toward his first son Julian, and the cruelty, bathing himself in the glow of secular holiness. We must also dismantle the working-class hero myth. Lennon was thoroughly middle-class. He was raised by his Aunt Mimi in a comfortable, semi-detached home on Menlove Avenue in the respectable suburb of Woolton. He attended art college, a privilege not afforded to the truly destitute of post-war Liverpool. He never worked a day in a mine, a factory, or on the docks. Ringo Starr came from the Dingle, a genuine slum. George Harrison was the son of a bus driver. John was the bourgeois outsider looking in, fetishizing a struggle he never actually lived. In his solo years, he adopted an exaggerated Scouse proletarian accent and sang about religion, sex, and television as tools of oppression. It was radical chic at its peak, flirting with political figures like Michael X and Jerry Rubin, but always from the safety of a limousine or a high-rise apartment. He was a parlor socialist who loved the abstract idea of the people, but frequently despised actual individuals. By the 1970s, Lennon's musical decline was evident, masked only by his dependence on top-tier session musicians. John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, 1970, remains a legitimate masterpiece. Raw, primal, a scream of honest pain regarding his mother and his own shattered psyche. But after that catharsis, the well began to run dry. The Lost Weekend, his 18-month separation from Yoko and descent into alcoholism in Los Angeles, is often romanticized. In reality, it was a sad spectacle of a man adrift, buoyed musically only by the professionalism of the Wrecking Crew, drummer Jim Keltner, and guitarist Jesse Ed Davis. His only solo #1 hit during his lifetime, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, owes its kinetic energy almost entirely to Elton John, who played piano and provided the vocal harmonies that gave the track its life. Fame, his funk collaboration with David Bowie, features a groove written by Carlos Alomar and a structure built by Bowie. John contributed backing vocals and a rhythm guitar lick. He had become a vampire, feeding off the energy of younger, more disciplined artists to stay relevant. Then came the house husband years, 1975-1980. The narrative tells us he retreated into a zen-like existence to raise his second son, Sean, and bake bread. The reality, according to insiders and his own diaries, was far darker. It was a period marked by profound boredom, depression, and continued drug use. When he finally re-emerged with Double Fantasy in 1980, the initial critical reception was mixed at best. Many critics found it mediocre, safe, and entrenched in adult contemporary blandness. Just Like Starting Over was a 1950s pastiche, a retreat to safety rather than a step forward. Had the assassination not occurred, it is highly probable that Lennon would have drifted into the 1980s, releasing mediocre synth-pop albums, struggling to find his footing in the MTV era, much like his peers, Paul with his cinematic broad strokes, the Stones with their internal warring, or Bowie's Phil Collins years. Death froze him at 40, preserving him as the eternal rebel. The tragedy transformed a mediocre comeback album into a sacred text. Why then do we still listen? Why does he matter? Because perfection is boring. Paul McCartney is perfect. His melodies are effortless, his musicality is boundless, and his public relations are impeccable. But Paul can also be plastic. Lennon was flawed, broken, lazy, and hypocritical, and that cuts deep. In Jealous Guy, he confesses to actual violence and insecurity. "Help!" is a terrified scream about the isolating horror of fame. Cold Turkey viscerally transmits the physical agony of withdrawal. His genius lay in his terrifying vulnerability, a voice that could transmit ugly, unvarnished human pain. We love him not because he was a hero, but because he was an anti-hero, a sinner who dared to record his sins. Technically, even in his decline, he remained a master of subverting standard forms. He delighted in twisting the ABBA rhyme structure and messing with time signatures. Good Morning is a rhythmic nightmare of changing bars, 5/4 to 3/4 to 4/4, all following the cadence of spoken speech. His tone on the Epiphone Casino, sanded down to the wood during the Revolution era, played with natural overdrive, was muddy, chaotic, and deeply human. His embrace of Arthur Janov's primal scream therapy changed rock vocals forever. Before Lennon, rock singing was often about control, pitch, and performative grit. After Lennon, it became about exorcism. He gave permission for grown men to scream, to let their voices crack, to sound ugly in the pursuit of emotional truth. Without the raw, shredding confessionals of the Plastic Ono band era, there is no grunge, there is no emo, there is no Kurt Cobain screaming into a microphone until his throat bleeds. Lennon validated the broken man, yet we cannot escape the damage he left behind. The tragedy of Julian Lennon is the dissonant chord that resolves to nothing. For John to preach universal love while ignoring his firstborn son, Julian had to buy his father's letters at an auction just to own a piece of him, is a hardness of heart that is difficult to forgive. Julian has recounted instances of John screaming at him for laughing, an emotionally erratic father figure who was physically present but spiritually miles away. And then there is the relationship with Paul, the tragedy of the century. They were soulmates who became enemies due to similar insecurities, handled through different coping mechanisms. Paul worked harder to drown out the silence. John used drugs and lashed out to fill the void. The magic of the Beatles lay in that tension. Paul framed John's chaos, giving it structure and melody. John sharpened Paul's sweetness, preventing it from becoming cloying. The Get Back documentary, 2021, provided a fascinating, high-definition audit of this dynamic. While it dispelled the myth of constant misery, showing moments of joy and connection, it also confirmed Lennon's abdication of leadership. We see a John Lennon who is frequently late, seemingly under the influence, and content to let Paul do the heavy lifting of organizing rehearsals and structuring songs. He is not the driving force. He is the talented, charismatic wildcard that the others are trying to keep engaged. The catalog remains indispensable not because of the myth, but in spite of it. His rhythm playing is imitated but never duplicated, that relentless strumming, the use of drones, the embrace of feedback. His lyrics, at their best, were a social mirror. Working Class Hero remains sociologically profound, dissecting the mechanism of social conditioning, even if the man singing it didn't live the life he described. Imagine, for all its hypocrisy, provided a fantasy that the world desperately needed to hear, a secular hymn for a godless age. The lesson of John Lennon is clear: do not emulate the man. Do not emulate the drug abuse, the negligence, the arrogance, or the cruelty. Emulate the honesty of the art, emulate the vulnerability, the rhythmic impulse, the refusal to be categorized. The greatest art often comes from the most flawed vessels. Lennon was not a guru. He was not a saint. He was a loudmouth from Liverpool who got lucky, got famous, got lost, and got shot. He caught lightning in a bottle just often enough for us to forgive his humanity. The fade out of Strawberry Fields Forever is beautiful, terrifying, discordant, and unresolved. Just like him. We do not need to deify him to appreciate him. Viewing him as jealous, insecure, talented, lazy, hypocritical, and brilliant makes the music more impressive, not less. He was not a god walking among us. He was one of us, stuck in the mud, desperately looking for a melody to make the pain stop for 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And that, in the end, is rock and roll.